ask the Lord to be with us. Lord Jesus, thank you for your love and grace. Thank you for your kindness to us. Meet with us and open your word and open us to it. Amen. So we're going to throw things off a little bit today. As much as I like praying in a series, you guys may be all seriesed out. It's like watching Netflix, watching me preach, because it's just episode 1, 2, 3, 4. But I wanted to throw things off and address things because the whole world is thrown off right now. As we were in church last week worshiping, a broken person was planning an atrocity in Las Vegas. The worst mass shooting in U.S. history, and that is saying a lot. It's getting to be almost routine, which is sick. The aerial photos of the police running, the pictures of people screaming and running, the phone videos with the sound of gunshots in the background. 58 people killed, 515 otherwise wounded. An untold psychological and spiritual damage that we'll see fall out for the next several decades. And I wouldn't be your pastor today if we didn't talk about that today. Philip Yancey, theologian and writer, calls it the question that will not go away. Why? Why is this happening? Why, especially when the victims are innocent? The shooter didn't know them. He couldn't even see them. They were points in his scope from as far away as he was. There is no great conflict, not even a racial or religious war behind this. Why? The question that echoes through all of human suffering, the babies who are born only to die an hour later, the child kidnapped and raised as a slave, the people ground into the dirt as people run away from a deranged person with a gun. Why? Yes. The problem of suffering is the rather tidy label the theologians give this discussion. Careers have been made by people who wrote book after book on this topic. People have brutal arguments over it. Faith is gained and often lost in the midst of the problem of suffering discussion. I will not tell you the answer to the problem of suffering today. I'm sorry. Anybody who tells you that they have a cut and dry answer to that question will sell you beachfront property in Terre Haute and a mountain cabin in Lafayette. There is no clean and tidy answer to the question on this side of heaven. There is nothing we can say to our fellow human beings in Las Vegas that will make their pain and rage evaporate. We can't make these images go away, and there is not a book you can read that will make the blood on the Las Vegas Strip any less ugly or wrong. Amen. There is always a glimmer to those who have been through the dark. This is a painfully beautiful one-liner poem from Atticus, who's an internet celebrity who writes these. Someone posted that earlier this week as the smoke cleared in Las Vegas. And I'm reminded that suffering is a lot of things to a lot of people, but that it is always, always personal. December 2014. We got together with my side of the family in Chicago. My sister lives in a duplex, and the other renters were gone, so we had this big house all to ourselves. And there were 14 of us in all. And we had a blast, especially the kids. An avalanche of gifts and plenty of cousins to play with. And in the midst of this crowded, lazy joy of big meals and sleeping in, Heather called me up to the back staircase, and she was crying. She was crying. Miscarriage. Miscarriage. It's one of those words like incident or accident that can never capture the reality. The fallen expectations of a face never seen, little hands never touched, you don't even know quite what to miss. There was life, there was movement somewhere, and then there wasn't. And in the midst of that crowded house, loud conversations and chattering TVs and laughing children, there was just her and me then laying in bed crying. I've studied different theories, I've read eloquent essays, I've heard amazing sermons on suffering and loss. I've been a hospital chaplain, I've seen tons of it firsthand. But the words felt like broken glass in my mouth. And any theologizing or philosophizing would have been profane in that shared darkness. Heather was just a matter of weeks along, maybe 7 or 8. Somewhere in our hearts, though, we knew that this little one was a girl, and we named her Eve Noel. Isabel bears her sister's name, Eve, as her middle name. We did our morning ritual of loss for Eve, spreading flower petals in the water of Lake Michigan. Just a moment's beauty to remember her. So we have 4 kids. And our 4th kid, Eve Noel, prays for us at the knee of Jesus himself, and will greet us at the renewing of all things. But right now it hurts. Right now there is pain and shared darkness. Right now no words are good enough, and no answer will hold all these tears. There are no tear-tight answers. None. Yet there is a glimmer from other places. There are 3 little joy monsters that I wake up to every morning. Every morning. Yesterday, Eugene, as the seasons change, he saw a mouse run through the hallway. And this may not happen in your house, but it happens in ours. And I hear, "Papa, I saw a mice! I saw a mice!" And I run over to his room, and he's sitting there with his blankets over his head going, "I saw a mice! You come and lay in my bed. That's what you do when I see a mice." There's Isabel, who was born after Eve left for heaven. Redemption in its own strange way. There is my amazing lady, who I am closer now to and more in love with than the day I met her. Eve is a fitting name for our little one on the other side. Eve in the sense of just about Christmas, Christmas Eve, All Hallows Eve, and the eve of something great. And this is where we live as the already but not yet people, as the people in the time between the times. We live in shared darkness, but the light flashes through. The light flashes through, and we know that it's from a greater source, which we will someday see. In my opinion, there is one question that anyone defending a worldview or a philosophy has to answer before anything. If anyone is trying to convince the world of a religion or a perspective or a philosophy, before they talk about any of these intricate questions, they have to answer the question, why? 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 So let's look at the story God gave us today, the crazy quilt that God gave us, to see how it addresses this question that will not go away. Now really though, if you want to see God addressing the question of suffering, just let your Bible fall open. There is blood and pain on every single page. There is the crucifixion right next to the resurrection. It's everywhere. And we'll look at just a few things today. Some points that I'll briefly touch on. Jesus. I think Jesus is the best way to address the problem of suffering. Christian faith has the advantage over any other worldview right now. That not only does God see our suffering, He joined it and experienced it firsthand. Yes. The time between the times, the world is not as it's supposed to be. Suffering feels wrong because it is wrong. Yes. The shared darkness. How do we respond to those in suffering? How do we stand or kneel with them? Again, please know that I will not be solving the problem of suffering for you today. I refuse to toss you a cut and dry answer to the messiest question of human life. I will not do that to you. I promise you no tear-tight answers. But I do believe that God has a word of hope for us, even in the darkness of yet another shooting, and this one the deadliest one yet. Now first, let me talk to you about the ancient world. The ancient world. Millennia ago. 30%, 1 in 3 children died before the age of 1. Many didn't make it through childhood. Houses usually had a dirt floor and one room for everything. They were cramped and smelly and uncomfortable, so most people spent their time outside. But outside, they poured sewage in the streets. It wasn't exactly better. 70% of the population lived in poverty, basically living hand to mouth most of the time, and perhaps half of that income was given to Rome for taxes. Israel was an occupied country with garrisons of Roman soldiers, a common sight in the streets. Criminals hung on crosses in public display was not an uncommon sight either. Then came the order from Herod to slaughter the babies. Males under 2 years old were systematically killed by the garrisons of Roman soldiers who patrolled the streets. They would enter your house, take the child, and kill them quickly and efficiently. They did not hate you. They didn't care. They were following orders. It was a systematic, machine-like genocide ordered by a king who was worried about his throne. And this is the world that Jesus was born into. This is where Jesus was a baby. No doubt his crying as a baby was heard among the screams of parents whose children were killed in front of him. The brutality of death was the backdrop while he learned to walk and talk. This is the world in which a head cold could kill you and clean water was a rare luxury that the Son of God was born into. There was blood in the streets that the Savior walked. Suffering, pain, and brutality were nothing new to him during his life. These realities did not come as a surprise. You know, as I get older, I find my favorite Bible verse gets shorter. When I was in college, it was a trend among over-serious evangelical kids like me to have a life verse. And you always had a life verse. What's your life verse, man? Hey, man, what's your life verse? You had it on your email signature, you tattooed it on your arm, that kind of thing. I went through a few different drafts of these, never did get the tattoos because my mom would have come at me with a cheese slicer, but that's a different story. Anyway. But the older I get, and the more I see of life, my favorite verse boils down to two words, recorded in John 11:35. Jesus wept. In John 11, Jesus' friend Lazarus has died. He comes to the tomb to tell them, and they tell him what happened. He's seen tombs before. He's buried his friends before. You walk a body into a jagged hole in the earth, you roll the stone back, and you never see them again. It was part of daily life. But Jesus knew that this day would be different. He knew that joy would break forth, unspeakable joy as Lazarus came back from the dead. This was going to happen in minutes. The greatest enemy of humanity, death, was about to be shown up. And it would be the happiest day of this family's life in moments, and Jesus wept. Now, a lot of folks will say Jesus wept because of the lack of faith of the people that were watching. Or maybe he saw everybody else and was crying out of sympathy for them. I'm reminded of this screensaver that my roommate had when I was in college years and years ago. This, to me, reeks of disappointment. Jesus crying because he sees how disobedient we are, and crying because of it. But I don't see that in John 11:35, Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus. I see Jesus crying because his heart is broken.
Yes.
Because his heart is broken.
Yes.
When Stephen Paddock unleashed hell on innocent people, Jesus wept. When people died there, ground into the dirt by those who ran over them, Jesus wept. I was at work one afternoon in Omaha. 15 squad cars came by, one after the other, so fast, and were scrambling to find out what's going on. 2 miles away at the mall, a deranged teenager had opened fire and killed 8 people. He is not there in this picture weeping because we are disappointing him. He's weeping because it hurts, and he knows it hurts. He knows how the pains of today will evaporate the moment we walk into his presence, and yet, he weeps. Elie Wiesel, a Jewish writer, whose most famous memoirs of concentration camps in World War II is called Night. He's good friends with the Christian author Francois Maurrac. Maurrac wrote an introduction to Wiesel's most famous book, in which he talks about his first meeting with him. He says, "And I, who believe that God is love, what answer could I give my young questioner, whose dark eyes still held the reflection of that angelic sadness? What did I say to him? Did I speak of the other Israeli, his brother, who may have resembled him, the crucified one, whose cross has conquered the world? Did I affirm that the stumbling block to his faith was a cornerstone of mine, and the conformity between the cross and the suffering of men was in my eyes the key to the impenetrable mystery whereon the faith of his childhood had perished? We do not know the worth of one single drop of blood, one single tear. All is grace. If the eternal is the eternal, the last word for each of us belongs to him. This is what I should have told my Jewish friend, but I could only hold him and weep." Weeping. In the faith of death, Jesus did not theologize. He didn't even move. He wept. And even with our hope and our theology and the great story, even with the happy ending already determined, if we don't weep, we are not human. And Jesus was and is, and so he does. The Bible offers no systematic answer to the problem of suffering. There is no great formula that says this happened because of this, so that this can happen. It's not in there. There is also no argument about the problem of suffering against God. That's not in there either. All of them have been anticipated. They're all there. But there is not a systematic answer to that. I'm reminded of a friend of mine whose son was in the neonatal ICU for several months with a disease they couldn't figure out. Some well-meaning Christian relatives came to visit, and they said, "Isn't it great that all these people are praying and turning to God because of your son?" And my friend said, "I don't care. I'm going to take my son home. I don't care." These systematic answers get us in trouble, and I think that's why the Bible doesn't lay them out like that. Let's look at what the Bible does not say about the problem of suffering. Two things today. The most famous study of suffering in the Old Testament, and perhaps in all of literature, is the story of Job. The origins of the story are a bit mysterious. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know exactly when they wrote. It's also set outside of Israel, where every other OT story is set right in the middle of Israel. It's very interesting. But that lends itself to the universality of the story. It is not a Christian story. It is not a Jewish story. It is a human story. The story of Job. The main text of Job is the dialogue of his comforters. Three friends who came to see him after he's lost everything. They dialogue for days and days, trying essentially to get Job to say what he did wrong so all this stuff would happen to him. That's what they tell him over and over and over again. You must have done something wrong. And Job says, "I haven't," and raises his lament to the heavens that seem silent. God shows up at the end and addresses the friends in Job 42.